A thin layer of snow already covered the road as the old car slowly climbed the winding mountain pass, leaving civilization behind. Wendy sat in the passenger seat, clenching her hands into fists, trying to hide her anxiety. Danny silently stared out the window, his large eyes reflecting the gloomy sky. "Here it is, our new home," Jack said, stopping the car in front of the enormous building. The Overlook Hotel stood alone, grim, silent, like a stone giant sleeping beneath the snow. Majestic columns supported its dark facade, and its black windows resembled empty eye sockets. Danny suddenly shivered and gripped his mother's hand tightly. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Wendy whispered anxiously. The boy swallowed the lump in his throat. He had seen this hotel in his dreams before. He had seen blood streaming down its corridors, faceless figures emerging from the shadows. He knew they had not arrived alone. "There's someone here," Danny said quietly, never taking his eyes off the building. Jack only scoffed as he unloaded the suitcases. "It's just an old hotel, son. You'll get used to it." But Danny knew they were already inside. They were waiting, and they wouldn't let them leave. The empty hotel greeted them with dead silence. Wendy walked through the hallways, glancing at the expensive carpets, massive chandeliers, and paintings on the walls. It seemed as if the Overlook was frozen in time, trapped in a past that refused to let go. Danny held his mother's hand, his eyes darting around as if searching for someone. "Strange," Wendy murmured. "Even when the place is empty, it feels like someone is watching." Jack laughed, dropping their things onto the floor. "It's just a hotel. You're imagining things." He turned to his son. "Do you like it, kid? All these rooms, these hallways. Just imagine the history here." Danny barely shook his head. He didn't want to tell them that he had already seen the woman in the green dress standing at the end of the corridor, watching them. She didn't move. Her empty eyes were fixed right on him. Later, while Jack was organizing his papers in the grand hall, Wendy prepared dinner, and Danny sat on the floor, drawing. He ran a red crayon across the paper, making chaotic lines, when suddenly his hand trembled. His vision blurred, and the world around him faded away. He was no longer in the room. He saw blood. It streamed down the long corridors, soaking the carpets, dripping from the walls. He heard distant laughter, wild, merciless, and saw his father's silhouette standing with an axe in his hands. His hands were covered in blood. Danny held his breath, trying to return to reality. But before the vision faded, he heard a whisper, "We are already here, and we will not let you escape." "Danny?" His mother's voice pulled him back into the warm room. The boy looked down, feeling the cold creep over his body. On the drawing he had just made, a single red word was scrawled, "Redrum." "What is this, sweetheart?" Wendy asked, leaning closer. Danny didn't know, but he felt that the answer would bring nothing but horror. Night fell quickly over the Overlook, wrapping the hotel in a thick silence, broken only by the wind howling through the chimneys. Wendy tucked Danny into bed, gently smoothing his blonde hair. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. It's just a new place. You just need time to get used to it." Danny didn't respond. He was staring at the dark corner of the room, where something seemed to shift, blending with the shadows. "They're here, Mom," he whispered. "Who, Danny?" Wendy felt a chill run down her spine. The boy squeezed his eyes shut. "They want us to stay, but I don't want to, Mom. I don't want to." Wendy held him close, trying to hide her own fear. "No one can hurt us. We're together, and everything will be fine." But deep down, she wasn't sure of her own words. Jack couldn't sleep. He sat at the typewriter in the hotel's grand hall, listening to the crackling of the firewood in the fireplace. His fingers hovered over the keys, but his thoughts were scattered. Ever since they had arrived, something had been keeping him from focusing. Then suddenly he heard it, a faint whisper, somewhere in the hallways. Jack lifted his head. "Wendy?" he called out. Silence. Had he imagined it? Or... He stood up and slowly walked toward the exit of the hall. The corridors were dark, with only the pale glow of the lamps cutting through the gloom. Then he heard it again. A whisper. Closer. His name. Jack swallowed hard and took a few more steps. And then... something let out a barely audible laugh. He spun around, but there was no one there. A cold shiver ran through him. Just exhaustion, he told himself. But as he turned back toward the hall, his eyes accidentally fell on the mirror by the entrance, and he froze. In the reflection behind him stood someone, a tall, dark figure with a faceless visage. Jack whipped around. The corridor was empty. But the mirror didn't lie. Morning at the Overlook was just as grim as the night before. The grey sky loomed over the mountains, and the wind hurled snow flurries against the windows. Wendy was making breakfast, trying not to think about the strange sounds she had heard during the night. Jack sat at the table, staring into his empty cup. He had barely slept, but something about him had changed. His eyes were bloodshot, and his fingers drummed nervously against the wood. "Dad?" Danny asked quietly. Jack slowly lifted his head. "What? Are you feeling okay?" For a moment Jack hesitated, then smiled, but the smile was strange, forced. "I'm fine, son. Just... this hotel, it has a strange energy, doesn't it?" Danny didn't answer. He knew that his father had already felt what lived within the walls of the Overlook. After breakfast, Danny wandered off to explore the hotel. His small footsteps echoed through the long corridors. He knew he shouldn't be doing this, but something was pulling him forward. He stopped in front of a door. A sign hung on it. 217. His heart pounded. He knew this room. It had appeared in his dreams, the dreams where the bathtub was filled with dark water and something hid beneath its surface. Danny took a step back, ready to run. But then, click! The door creaked open on its own. The darkness beyond seemed alive. Danny held his breath. A chill crawled over his skin, seeping into his bones. Then he heard it, a faint rustling, as if something was moving inside. "Who's there?" he whispered. No answer, but the door began to open wider. A figure emerged from the shadows. A woman. She was tall. Her skin had a sickly greenish hue, and wet strands of hair clung to her face, dripping onto the floor. Her face was twisted, rotting. Her eyes, black and empty, locked onto Danny. And then she smiled. Danny screamed. He turned and ran, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. His heart pounded wildly in his chest. He didn't stop until he reached his room, diving under the blankets, trembling with terror. Somewhere in the hotel, soft laughter echoed. It knew that the boy had seen it, and now it would come again. Darkness once again swallowed the overlook, pierced only by the howling wind outside. The hotel seemed to come alive at night. The floors creaked for no reason, doors shuddered, and distant footsteps echoed through the halls. Danny lay in his bed, trying not to breathe too loudly. He was afraid that if he made even the slightest sound, they would hear him. His body still remembered the icy chill that radiated from the woman in room 217. Her eyes empty like two black voids. "Danny!" A whisper drifted from the darkness. The boy froze. The voice came from the hallway. He tried to pull the blanket over himself, but the sound didn't stop. It was getting closer. Danny. The same voice again, now right outside his door. He couldn't scream. Click! The door creaked open just a little. Through the narrow gap, he could see it, and that was enough. A pale hand reached through the opening, its fingers long, its nails dark and jagged. It stretched toward him. Danny clenched his eyes shut and imagined he wasn't there, that he was somewhere far away. And then the hand was gone. The door remained ajar, but there was no one behind it anymore. He didn't know how long he lay there, afraid to move. But suddenly he heard another sound, his father's voice. Only it didn't sound right. Jack sat in the grand hall, staring at the blank sheet of paper in front of him. His eyes were glassy, his fingers gripping the typewriter so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "Right," a voice whispered behind him. Jack slowly turned his head. An empty room, but he could feel someone there. "Right." The whisper came again, and suddenly his hands started moving on their own. Clack, 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 letters appeared on the page, words he hadn't meant to type. He must stay. They all must stay. His fingers kept pressing the keys. Jack's eyes widened, his lips moved, repeating the same phrase, "They all must stay." And somewhere deep within the hotel, someone was smiling. The snow outside grew thicker, sealing the hotel off from the world. The overlook felt trapped in time, and Danny knew they were not alone here. That morning, he woke with a heavy weight on his chest. He knew something had changed, something had gotten worse. When he stepped into the hallway, he saw his father. Jack stood in the middle of the long corridor, staring deep into the empty wall. His lips moved, but no sound came out. "Dad?" Danny called softly. Jack flinched, snapping his head around. "What are you doing here, boy?" His voice was rough, sharper than usual. I just... Danny stammered, realizing that something about his father was wrong. Jack stepped closer, his eyes glinting with a dark, twisted madness. "You shouldn't wander alone. There are dangers here." His lips curled into a strange, almost predatory grin. Danny took a step back, and at that moment, he heard it. Slosh. 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 He turned his head. From the far end of the corridor, slowly, a red wave began to rise. Blood. It gushed from the walls, soaked the carpets, dripped from the ceiling, and within that crimson flood, Danny saw them. People in old-fashioned clothing, guests of the hotel who had long ceased to be alive. They were staring straight at him. "Dad!" Danny screamed, but Jack only stood there, his face frozen in eerie calm. "They just want to welcome you, son." His voice was almost gentle. Danny screamed, turned and ran. Wendy found him in his room, curled up in the corner, pale as a sheet. "Danny, what happened?" The boy couldn't speak. His body trembled, his eyes wide with terror. "We have to leave," he finally whispered. "What?" "We have to leave. The hotel, it won't let us go." Wendy felt the hairs on her arms rise, and from the hallway just beyond the door, a quiet laughter echoed. Wendy clutched Danny tightly in her arms, listening to the faint sounds of something shifting in the hallway beyond the door. She knew it wasn't the wind, nor the old building settling. Someone was there. "We have to go, Mom," Danny whispered, his lips trembling. "But how?" Wendy's mind raced. They were cut off from the world. The roads were buried in snow. The phone lines were dead. She glanced out the window. The blizzard raged, slamming against the glass, sealing off any chance of escape. Meanwhile, Jack was descending into the boiler room. His movements were slow, trance-like. "They told me, you know what must be done," a voice echoed in his mind. He smiled. Now everything was clear. His family, they were the enemy. They wouldn't let him finish what he needed to do. They wanted to take him away from the Overlook, but the hotel would not allow it. Jack bent down and picked up the axe resting in the corner. His fingers wrapped around the cold steel, and he ran his hand along the sharp edge with a quiet pleasure. "I won't let you leave," he whispered. Danny awoke with a sickening jolt. He knew Dad was coming for them. "Mom, we have to hide, now!" He grabbed Wendy's hand, pulling her toward the door. "Danny, what's happening?" The answer came immediately. Thud. Something heavy struck the door. Thud. "Wendy, open the door." Jack's voice was slow, distorted. Wendy stumbled backward. "Jack!" Thud! The axe splintered the wooden door, leaving a deep gash. "Wendy, open the door!" she screamed, yanking Danny's hand and darting toward the bathroom. Her heart pounded in her chest. From outside, Jack's heavy breathing filled the air. "I know you're in there," he whispered, dragging the axe blade against the wood. Danny squeezed his mother's hand. "Mom, we can't escape." Wendy trembled. She knew Jack was no longer Jack, and if they didn't find a way out, they wouldn't survive the night. Thud! The axe struck the door again. The wood splintered, and through the narrow gap, Jack's mad eye peered inside. "There you are," he sang, licking his lips, as if savoring the fear of his wife and son. Wendy grabbed a knife from the table. Her hands trembled, but she stood her ground, positioning herself between Jack and Danny. "Get away, Jack!" she screamed. Jack grinned, a cruel, unnatural smile. "But we're family." His voice dripped with eerie amusement. "And we have to stay here. Forever.thud! Exclamation mark, thud! More strikes. The door was nearly broken through. Panic clawed at Wendy's throat. Danny didn't take his eyes off the jagged hole in the door. His small body stiffened, his gaze darkened, and then he heard the voice. "Run, boy, to the boiler room. He can't reach it." Danny shuddered. He knew this voice, Dick Halloran, the cook who had once told him about the shining. Danny understood. He had to act. "Mom!" He yanked Wendy's hand. "We have to lead him to the boiler room." "What?" Wendy was frantic. "The hotel wants him to stay." Danny's voice turned cold. "But if we make it lose control, everything will change. For a moment, Wendy stared into her son's eyes. Then she nodded. "Okay, crack!" Jack tore a chunk of the door away, shoving his hand inside, reaching for the lock. Wendy slashed down with the knife. "Ah!" Jack howled, stumbling back, clutching his wrist. It was enough. "Run!" Wendy screamed. They bolted from the bathroom, racing past Jack. Danny ran through the hallways, his heart hammering. He could feel the hotel fighting him. The paintings on the walls came to life, their figures whispering, "Don't run, stay." The ceiling cracked, the lights flickered. The building knew it was being deceived. Danny reached the boiler room. The fire inside still burned, and the pressure gauge was spiking. If no one released the steam, the whole place would explode. And then, bang! The door behind him flew open. Jack, bleeding, exhausted, but still lost in madness. "There you are," he whispered, raising the axe. "Dad, you have to remember who you are." Danny cried. Jack froze. This isn't you, Dad. It's the hotel. It's making you do this." Jack's grip on the axe tightened, and behind him they appeared. The ghosts of the Overlook's past guests, watching with empty eyes. "Kill him," one whispered. "Give us the boy." A woman in a decayed dress murmured, but Danny saw it. Something changed in his father's gaze. Fear. Jack turned and saw them. He understood. He had never been in control. "No," he whispered. "No, you won't make me." Danny took a step back. Jack turned toward the boiler, and then it hit him. The pressure gauge was in the red. "It's going to blow," he gasped. His hands shook. The ghosts reached for him. "Give us your son and you can stay forever." Jack trembled, and then he made his choice. He grabbed the release valve and yanked it open. Steam erupted from the pipes with a deafening hiss. Danny turned and ran. "Go!" Jack roared. Wendy grabbed Danny as they raced away, and behind them, a thunderous explosion. Wendy and Danny stumbled into the snow, the freezing wind slapping their faces. Behind them, the Overlook burned. Flames devoured the walls, shattered the windows, and with it, its ghosts disappeared. They made their way down the mountain. Wendy held Danny's hand, barely believing they had survived. "Dad," Danny whispered, glancing back. He knew his father had saved them, but he had stayed behind, or a part of him had. The wind whispered through the snow, and for just a moment, Danny heard a faint voice from far away. "Be strong, son." Danny closed his eyes. Then they kept walking, and they never looked back.